It was supposed to be routine, a simple pickup, a quiet car ride, another day in royal service. But when a veteran palace driver looked down at the assignment sheet and saw the name waiting for him, something inside him shifted. No hesitation, no explanation, just 3 words that sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. I won't go, in a place where obedience is currency and silence is survival. Defiance is almost unheard of. What did he see on that page? And why did it carry Camilla's personal authorization? The answer would expose tensions the palace had worked for years to keep buried. He was not a reckless man. He was not emotional. For more than 3 decades, he had driven through storms, political storms, media storms, family storms. He had transported monarchs to state banquets and rushed them through back entrances during moments of scandal. He had witnessed tears no camera ever caught and conversations no memoir would ever record. Loyalty wasn't just his job, it was his identity. The motor pool was his kingdom, and precision was its law. Inside that world, everything ran on rhythm. Engines checked, routes memorized, security briefings delivered in calm, clipped tones. There was pride in the routine, pride in invisibility. The cars gleamed, the drivers stood straight, no drama, no questions, just service. So when the assignment sheet slid across the desk that morning, it should have been like any other. Instead, as his eyes scanned the typed instructions, he froze. At the bottom of the page, beneath the coded route and private gate access, was a name. And beneath that name, authorization, by Her Majesty Queen Camilla. His jaw tightened. The silence stretched too long. A younger driver glanced up, confused. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. The veteran didn't answer at first. He read the name again, as if hoping it would rearrange itself into something less dangerous. It didn't. He placed the paper back on the desk with deliberate care. "I won't go," he said. The room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Drivers do not refuse assignments. They don't debate them, they execute them. Within minutes, supervisors were called. Questions were fired in hushed but urgent tones. Was he unwell? Misinformed? Had he misunderstood the route? He shook his head. Calm, controlled, certain. Whispers began to ripple through the motor pool. Camilla had personally insisted on this pickup. No substitutions, no delays. Discretion was critical. That detail alone made the refusal seismic. She had bypassed standard scheduling channels. She had made this direct. The supervisors pressed harder, reminding him of his duty, his spotless record, his years of trust. He listened, he respected them, but he did not bend. There was something about that name, something steeped in past controversy, unresolved questions, and public fury that made this more than transportation. It felt like complicity, and as tension thickened in the air, one truth began to settle like cold fog. This wasn't about a ride. It was about who was being brought back into the royal orbit and why. The name on that page was not just controversial, it was potentially explosive. But to understand why a man who had served the crown without question would suddenly defy it, we must first understand the quiet power Camilla had been consolidating behind palace doors. Camilla was never meant to be at the center of power. For years, she stood at the edge of the royal stage, tolerated by some, scrutinized by many, always aware that her position had been earned through resilience rather than affection. But power rarely arrives in a single dramatic moment. It gathers quietly, it builds in corridors and private conversations, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, her influence began to expand. Staff reshuffles, quiet appointments, strategic loyalties secured one handshake at a time. Those who underestimated her did so at their peril. At first, the changes seemed procedural. A communications aide reassigned, a private secretary replaced, a trusted confidant installed in a role traditionally controlled by others. Nothing explosive, nothing headline-worthy. Yet within palace walls, these subtle moves carried weight. Influence inside the monarchy is not measured by titles alone. It is measured by access, by proximity, by whose advice reaches the monarch first, and increasingly insiders whispered that certain decisions were no longer passing through traditional royal channels. Long-serving staff members began to feel the shift. Some spoke of a new rhythm in internal meetings. Others sensed tension between the old guard and Camilla's emerging inner circle. There were murmurs of frustration, quiet, careful, but real. Protocol had always been sacred. Now it felt negotiable. Not abolished, but bent. And then came the discreet meetings. They did not appear on official schedules. They were arranged through private lines, confirmed verbally, documented sparingly, no press leaks, no public acknowledgement. Yet the pattern was undeniable. Conversations were happening beyond the usual advisory structure. Strategic conversations. Conversations that hinted at long-term positioning rather than short-term optics. This was not recklessness, it was calculation. Staff began using a phrase in hushed tones. Parallel influence. The suggestion was subtle but loaded, that alongside the visible hierarchy of the monarchy, another current of authority was flowing. One guided by loyalty to Camilla personally, not merely to the institution. For some, it represented modernization. For others, it felt like disruption disguised as progress. The driver's refusal did not erupt in isolation. It landed on soil already fertile with unease. Because when Camilla personally authorized that pickup, bypassing standard scheduling channels and overriding normal security vetting, it sent a message. She did not delegate it. She did not soften it. She insisted. The transport was to be private, discreet, immediate. That level of direct intervention was rare, even for a queen. And those who had been watching the quiet expansion of her influence recognized something else. This was not the first controversial maneuver. It was simply the boldest. Previous decisions had stirred discomfort. This one risked exposure. The pickup was not logistical, it was strategic. Some within the palace wondered whether this was about consolidation. Others suspected damage control. A few feared it was something far more dangerous, an alliance being rebuilt in shadows. What made it unsettling was not just who might be arriving, but why such urgency surrounded their return. There was an undercurrent of desperation woven into the request, the kind of urgency that suggests stakes too high to delay. And in a monarchy built on tradition and stability, urgency is often the most revealing emotion of all. The veteran driver sensed it instinctively. This was not a favor, not a courtesy. It was part of something larger. A move on a board most people did not even realize they were standing on. And then the name on the assignment sheet surfaced, a name that explained everything and yet made the situation far worse. When the driver read the name, time seemed to slow. It wasn't a dignitary, not a diplomat, not a trusted advisor. It was someone long associated with scandal, someone whose presence near the royal family had once ignited public outrage and forced carefully worded statements from palace spokespeople. And now, years after that storm had supposedly passed, Camilla wanted this individual discreetly transported into a royal residence. No announcement, no record, no press. Why would she risk everything for this? The name belonged to a former royal associate who had once moved easily through palace corridors, laughing at private dinners, whispering counsel at strategic moments. They had been more than a social acquaintance, they had been trusted. Photographed beside senior royals, included in guest lists that signaled favor, but favor inside the monarchy can evaporate overnight. And when allegations surface, serious, reputation-damaging allegations, the association became radioactive. The palace had distanced itself swiftly. Statements were issued, invitations quietly withdrawn. The associate vanished from official events as if erased from memory. It was the kind of scandal that leaves a permanent shadow even after headlines fade. Public trust wavered. Critics sharpened their voices. For a time, the monarchy seemed to stand at the edge of reputational collapse. Recovery had taken years, and now that same figure was being summoned back through a private gate under Camilla's personal authority. The driver understood the implications immediately. He had driven through that earlier crisis. He remembered the protests, the cameras, the tension in the air thick enough to taste. He had watched senior royals step into vehicles with carefully neutral expressions, while inside, frustration and fear simmered. Bringing this person back into proximity of the crown would not be interpreted as forgiveness, it would be interpreted as endorsement, and there would be chaos. The secrecy of the request only deepened the alarm. There would be no official motorcade, no flashing outriders, no ceremonial acknowledgement, just a quiet pickup, a direct route, a private entrance, the kind of discretion reserved for matters deemed too sensitive for even internal logs. It was as though the meeting itself was being treated as a state secret. Inside the motor pool, opinions fracture. Some staff urged compliance. It's not our place to question, one whispered. Others were visibly shaken. They remembered the public fury. They remembered the way headlines had torn into the monarchy's credibility. This wasn't just about loyalty to a queen. It was about loyalty to the institution. For the driver, the conflict was deeply personal. He had pledged his service to the crown, not to individual ambition, not to private agendas. Obedience had guided his career, yet conscience now tugged at him with unsettling force. Was he protecting the monarchy by refusing or undermining it by defying authority? The weight of that question pressed against him like a physical force. And then another possibility emerged, one even more chilling. What if this wasn't a simple reunion? What if this was damage control disguised as reconciliation? Or worse, an alliance being rebuilt for strategic leverage? The associate still held knowledge, secrets, stories that had never reached the public. In the wrong hands, those stories could wound the monarchy irreparably. Perhaps this meeting wasn't about redemption at all. Perhaps it was about containment. Perhaps it was about containment. That thought settled heavily among those who knew the full history. If Camilla was orchestrating this privately, it meant the stakes were enormous. Political, personal, protective. No one knew for certain, but everyone understood the risk. The driver's refusal, then, was not impulsive. It was a line drawn in quiet defiance against something he feared could spiral beyond control. And as the palace absorbed the shock of his decision, it became clear this was no longer about a car ride or a controversial guest. But the refusal did more than halt a car. It triggered a confrontation that would expose cracks within the palace itself. Voices rose, doors closed. And for the first time in years, palace protocol fractured in plain sight. A senior aide demanded compliance with a tone sharpened by disbelief. The driver stood firm, shoulders squared, not in rebellion but in resolve. He wasn't protesting the crown, he was protecting it. At least, that was what he believed. But from what? And why was Camilla so determined that this pickup happened without delay? They moved him into a private office away from the motor pool, away from listening ears. The atmosphere shifted from confusion to confrontation. Decades of loyal service hung in the air like a fragile shield. A supervisor leaned forward and reminded him of his oath, his spotless record, his proximity to history. "You don't get to choose assignments," the aide said, voice low but cutting. "You carry them out." The driver did not raise his voice. That unsettled them more than anger would have. He chose his words carefully. He spoke of concerns about reputational damage. He spoke of memory, of how fragile public trust had once become when this same name filled newspaper columns. He did not accuse. He did not speculate. But he made one thing clear. Bringing that individual back into a royal residence without transparency was a gamble the monarchy might not survive twice. The aide bristled. "Allegations are not convictions," he snapped. "The palace has moved on. But had it?" The driver held the gaze without flinching. The allegations may have faded from headlines, he implied, but they had never been fully resolved in the court of public opinion, and perception in a monarchy can be as lethal as proof. The exchange grew heated. It was no longer about transportation. It was about obedience versus judgment. Was loyalty blind compliance? Or was it the courage to intervene when something felt dangerously wrong? The aide insisted that hierarchy existed for a reason. The driver countered that hierarchy should never override conscience. The room tightened with the weight of that divide. Within minutes, the message traveled upward. Camilla was informed that her direct instruction had been refused. In her office, shock rippled beneath composed silence. No one refused her. Not openly. Not after she had personally authorized the order. This was not just defiance, it was precedent-shattering. Pressure followed swiftly. The driver was reminded politely at first of possible consequences. Suspension. Reassignment. A career concluded not with honor but with a quiet dismissal. The implication was unmistakable: comply or risk everything you've built. He listened without interruption. Years of service had taught him patience. Then, with a calmness that bordered on unshakable, he spoke the words that would echo through the corridors long after the meeting ended. Some lines shouldn't be crossed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't shouted, but it carried the weight of conviction. In that moment, the veteran driver stood not as an employee, but as a man drawing a boundary against what he believed could fracture the monarchy from within. The aide left the room unsettled. The decision now lay beyond the motor pool, and as word quietly reached higher levels of the royal household, a deeper power struggle began to surface. Behind gilded doors, alliances began to shift. Some saw the driver as insubordinate, a man who had forgotten his place in a system built on order. Others saw something rarer: courage in its quietest form. But the real fracture wasn't about a chauffeur refusing a route. It was about authority, about who truly held it. Was Camilla acting independently, driven by her own agenda? Or was this part of a larger royal strategy that only a select few understood? Inside senior offices, the debate unfolded with careful words and guarded expressions. Aides who had spent decades mastering palace diplomacy now found themselves choosing sides without hope and declaring it. One faction insisted the refusal threatened the monarchy's structure. If staff began weighing personal judgment against royal directives, the chain of command would crumble. Discipline had to be preserved. Another faction argued the opposite, that blind obedience in the face of potential scandal was far more dangerous than one man's resistance. The fear of public backlash loomed heavily over every whispered exchange. If news of the private meeting leaked, and leaks had a way of surfacing when least expected, the narrative would not focus on discretion. It would focus on secrecy. And secrecy, in a modern monarchy, is often interpreted as guilt. Advisors calculated headlines in their minds, imagined panel debates dissecting motives, pictured approval ratings slipping. The crown had weathered storms before, but it had never been invincible. Then came the question no one dared voice too loudly. Did the king know? Some believed he must have been informed. Decisions of this magnitude rarely occurred in total isolation. Others suspected he had been shielded, either to protect plausible deniability or because the initiative had originated elsewhere. The uncertainty created something more volatile than disagreement: doubt. And doubt inside a royal household spreads like a hairline crack in glass, almost invisible at first, but capable of shattering everything under pressure. Traditionalists, loyal to established hierarchy, bristled at what they perceived as a shift in internal balance. Reform-minded aides, however, saw an opportunity. They believed the monarchy needed to adapt, to control narratives before narratives controlled them. To them, Camilla's assertiveness signaled strength, not recklessness. Yet even they struggled to explain the urgency behind this specific meeting. Why this person? Why now? Speculation intensified. Was Camilla positioning herself strategically, consolidating influence while others hesitated? Was she attempting to neutralize a lingering threat before it reemerged publicly? Or was this about loyalty repaying past allegiance in a moment of vulnerability? Each theory carried its own risks. Each suggested a power structure more complex than the public ever imagined. Meanwhile, in quieter corners of the palace, the driver's colleagues watched with mixed emotions. Some avoided eye contact, wary of association. Others offered subtle gestures of solidarity, a nod, a hand on the shoulder, an unspoken acknowledgement that he had voiced what many feared to articulate. His stand had unsettled them, but it had also exposed a truth. Loyalty without boundaries can become complicity. And through it all, one silence echoed louder than any argument, the silence from the king's office. No immediate endorsement, no rebuke, no clarification, just stillness. In a household accustomed to swift messaging, that absence of response felt deliberate or ominous. The debate did not end, it deepened. Loyalties hardened. Strategies recalculated. What began as a transport refusal had evolved into a referendum on influence and control within the monarchy itself. And as tension tightened its grip on the palace, one thing became undeniable. This was no longer about whether the pickup would happen. It was about who would define the monarchy's future. Then came the moment no one expected: Camilla's personal response. She didn't send an aide this time. She called directly. The line was secure, the message unmistakable. The pickup would proceed with or without him. There was no raised voice, no overt anger, just control. Controlled words, controlled breathing, controlled authority. Yet beneath that calm composure, something sharper flickered. Urgency, perhaps even desperation. What was so critical about this meeting that it justified Bendon, G protocol, risking public fallout, and confronting a loyal servant head-on? Camilla did not waste time on pleasantries. She reminded him of his years of service, his reputation, the trust placed in him. Then she pivoted. The passenger, she said, was essential, not optional, not sentimental. Essential. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Essential to what, to whom? She did not elaborate fully, but she hinted that this was a private matter tied to royal stability, something delicate, something that required discretion rather than debate. There was steel beneath her tone. The quiet steel of someone accustomed to being underestimated and determined never to relinquish ground again. This was not a queen issuing an emotional demand. It was a strategist protecting a move already set in motion. Yet the longer she spoke, the more something else seeped through a defensiveness masked as authority. As though she knew how this would look if exposed and resented that perception before it even formed. The driver listened carefully. He did not interrupt. When he finally responded, his voice was steady, almost gentle. He expressed respect. He acknowledged her position. But he could not ignore his concern. Bringing that individual back into proximity of the crown under secrecy would reopen wounds that had barely scarred. It would raise questions no press office could easily contain. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "this may protect something in the short term, but at what cost?" There was a pause on the line, a silence that stretched longer than etiquette allowed. Then came the implicit threat, not shouted, not explicit, but unmistakable. Refusal could carry consequences. A suspension, a review, perhaps early retirement. The palace did not tolerate insubordination, especially when authority had been exercised directly. His career, decades of loyalty, trust, sacrifice. He could end not with ceremony, but with a quiet administrative note. He absorbed the weight of that reality. He had driven monarchs through history, but history would not drive him back. Some lines shouldn't be crossed. Some lines shouldn't be crossed. Some lines shouldn't be crossed. He repeated, more softly this time. It wasn't defiance for its own sake. It was conviction. Camilla did not argue further. That perhaps was the most telling moment of all. Instead, she ended the call with decisive finality. If he would not carry out the order, another would. Arrangements shifted instantly. An alternate vehicle was secured. A different driver assigned. The machine of the monarchy moved on, efficient and unyielding, yet something had changed. In arranging the alternate transport so swiftly, Camilla demonstrated resolve, but she also planted a seed of doubt that would linger long after the engine started. Why such secrecy? Why such haste? If the meeting were harmless, why cloak it in shadows? The more forcefully she insisted, the more the unanswered questions multiplied. The driver watched from a distance as the contingency plan unfolded. He had not stopped the meeting. He had not altered the course of events, but he had exposed tension beneath the polished surface of royal unity. And as the substitute car prepared to depart through a private route, one truth pulsed quietly beneath the palace's composure. This was no longer simply about authority. It was about trust. The alternative car arrived. The passenger was collected, and what happened next would confirm the driver's deepest fears. The vehicle entered through a private gate, curtains drawn, no official log, no acknowledgement. Inside one of the monarchy's most discreet residences, a property rarely mentioned in press briefings and almost never photographed, a meeting began that was never meant to surface. It was arranged with precision and silence, but whispers have a way of slipping through even the thickest stone walls, and what insiders would later reveal painted a picture not of reconciliation, but negotiation, high-stakes negotiation. The location itself carried meaning. T was not a public palace wing, not a grand hall meant for diplomacy. It was a controlled environment, shielded from routine staff traffic, staffed only by those personally vetted. Privacy was not simply requested, it was enforced. Even senior aides were told only what they needed to know. The arrival time was staggered, access points restricted. This was not casual, it was calculated. The meeting lasted far longer than anyone expected. An hour passed, then two staff assigned to peripheral duties began exchanging uncertain glances. If this had been a courtesy visit, it would have concluded swiftly. If it had been a simple apology or farewell, it would not require such duration. Time, in this context, suggested depth. It suggested leverage. Though no official transcript exists, fragments of what transpired began circulating almost immediately among those close enough to sense tension. Raised voices were reported behind closed doors, not constant, but sharp enough to be unmistakable. The conversation was not nostalgic. It was pointed, direct, at times heated. The alleged focus? Legacy. Influence? Reputation. The controversial associate, long absent from royal orbit, was not simply seeking forgiveness. There were discussions, insiders suggested, about rehabilitation, about reshaping public perception through carefully curated appearances, controlled narratives, selective philanthropy, the kind of image restoration that requires not just strategy, but endorsement. And endorsement within the monarchy is power. For Camilla, the calculation may have been brutally pragmatic. Short-term scandal versus long-term control. If the associate felt alienated, sidelined, or resentful, that resentment could metastasize. Stories untold can become stories sold. Secrets buried can become weapons. Perhaps bringing this figure back under controlled conditions was an attempt to contain risk rather than invite it. But containment is a gamble, because in attempting to manage a threat privately, one risks magnifying it publicly. Staff unease intensified as the hours stretched on. Those aware of the identity involved felt the weight of history pressing forward. The monarchy had only recently steadied itself after previous controversies. Trust, once shaken, does not fully restore, it merely stabilizes. Reopening that chapter, even discreetly, risked reigniting suspicion across the nation. And then there was the driver. He stood apart from the inner circle, no longer directly involved yet deeply aware. He watched the alternative vehicle depart. He understood the route. He knew the gate. He did not need confirmation to sense that his fears were unfolding exactly as anticipated. He had not acted out of defiance, but out of foresight. And now, as the meeting continued behind closed doors, his unease hardened into something quieter and more troubling: vindication. Because the longer the meeting endured, the clearer it became that this was not a harmless courtesy call. It was a negotiation over influence within one of the most scrutinized institutions on Earth, and negotiations by nature involve concessions. When the vehicle finally departed hours later, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. No public statement, no acknowledgement, just resumed normalcy as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But inside the palace, nothing felt normal anymore. But secrets inside the palace rarely stay buried for long, and this one was about to explode. 48 hours later, a journalist's phone rang. A tip, a name, a private gate. At first it sounded like rumor, the kind of palace gossip that circulates quietly and dies quickly. But this was different. The caller had details. A time, a vehicle switch, an unlogged entrance. And just like that, the quiet refusal that had nearly dissolved into internal paperwork became the spark for something far larger. The press began asking questions, and the palace, so accustomed to shaping the narrative, found itself chasing it instead. The leak was anonymous but precise. The controversial associate had been seen entering a secluded royal residence. No official event, no public record, no explanation. Within hours, reporters were piecing together timelines. They began connecting dots that the palace had hoped would remain scattered. Why was this individual back in royal proximity? Who authorized it? And most dangerously, what was discussed? Speculation spiraled at breakneck speed. News panels dissected the silence. Social media ignited with outrage. Commentators resurrected past allegations, replaying old controversies as if they had never faded. The monarchy, which had worked painstakingly to stabilize its public image, suddenly faced a wave of renewed scrutiny. Transparency was demanded, accountability questioned. The optics were brutal, and at the center of it all stood Camilla. Her judgment was no longer being debated behind palace doors, it was being scrutinized across the nation. Critics argued that secrecy suggested impropriety. Supporters insisted there must be a larger strategic rationale. But even those sympathetic to her influence struggled to explain why such a sensitive meeting had been conducted without formal acknowledgement. The more the palace remained silent, the louder the accusations became. Public trust, once bruised, is fragile. The monarchy had long depended on the illusion of unity and moral steadiness. Now that illusion wavered. Talk of parallel influence resurfaced in headlines. Analysts questioned whether authority within the institution had become too concentrated, too insulated from oversight. The narrative shifted from a private meeting to a broader debate about transparency in a modern constitutional monarchy, and then something unexpected happened. The driver's refusal, once framed internally as insubordination, was recast by the public as moral courage. Commentators praised his instinct. His quiet defiance became symbolic, an ordinary man standing firm against what he believed could damage the crown. His words, "Some lines shouldn't be crossed," began circulating widely, quoted as though they were a warning ignored. Inside the palace, damage control moved swiftly but cautiously. Statements were drafted, redrafted, softened. The meeting was described as informal and private. No further detail was offered. But the absence of transparency only deepened suspicion. Each carefully crafted sentence felt reactive rather than authoritative. Internal tension intensified. Senior aides argued over strategy. Some urged full disclosure to calm the storm. Others insisted that revealing details would validate the controversy. The king's silence became a subject of its own speculation. Was he endorsing the decision or distancing himself from it? Every pause was interpreted, every non-answer dissected. The driver, meanwhile, remained silent. He did not seek attention. He did not give interviews. Yet his absence from public commentary only heightened his symbolic presence. His choice had forced a spotlight onto something the palace preferred to keep dim. What began as a private negotiation had transformed into a national debate. Power, loyalty, transparency, authority, all of it intertwined in a narrative that refused to fade. And in the aftermath, one final decision would determine whether this was a passing storm or a turning point in royal history. The driver's badge was quietly reviewed, Camilla's authority subtly questioned, and inside the palace, trust felt thinner than ever. What began as a routine assignment had evolved into a reckoning. Was this a story of insubordination or integrity, of ambition or desperation? One measured refusal forced the monarchy to confront a truth it had long avoided. Power behind the throne can be just as volatile as power on it. Behind closed doors, discussions about the driver's future unfolded with surgical caution. There were those who demanded discipline, protocol had been challenged, authority had been tested. If boundaries were not reinforced, what precedent would that set? Yet there were others, quieter, more strategic voices who warned that punishing him outright would only validate the public's newfound admiralty. He had become a symbol. To dismiss him would transform controversy into martyrdom, and so his fate hung in limbo, not celebrated, not condemned. A review conducted with deliberate ambiguity. Suspension was considered, then reconsidered. Reassignment floated as a compromise. But beneath the administrative language lay a deeper question. Had he acted recklessly, or had he protected the crown from itself? Camilla, meanwhile, recalibrated. Public appearances continued, but her tone shifted subtly. Where once there had been assertive confidence, there was now measured restraint. Statements emphasized unity, continuity, stability. The palace projected calm. Yet those attuned to nuance sensed a tightening of control. Access narrowed. Internal communication streamlined. Information shared on a stricter need-to-know basis. The household was closing ranks. The meeting itself was never fully explained. It faded from official mention, replaced by newer headlines. But the public had already drawn its own conclusions. Approval ratings flickered. Commentators debated the balance between privacy and accountability. The monarchy, long accustomed to commanding respect through tradition, now faced a generation demanding transparency. And in that shift, the driver's quiet defiance took on symbolic weight. He had not sought rebellion. He had not courted attention. Yet his refusal became a reminder that loyalty does not always mean silence. That sometimes the most stabilizing act is resistance. One man, positioned at the lowest visible rung of royal hierarchy, had momentarily disrupted the machinery of influence at the highest levels. Inside the palace, unity felt more fragile. Conversations once assumed to be aligned now carried undercurrents of doubt. Who had known about the meeting in advance? Who had supported it privately? Who had opposed it but remained silent? These questions led, angered, unspoken but potent. The monarchy survived the storm. It always does. But survival is not the same as strength. A crack, once formed, may not shatter the structure immediately. It may simply wait. And perhaps that is the lasting consequence of this episode. Not scandal, not dismissal, not even reputational damage, but awareness. Awareness that influence within the monarchy is not monolithic. That loyalty can collide with conscience. That power, when exercised in secrecy, invites scrutiny that cannot be entirely contained. The driver returned to duty quietly, his presence unchanged yet undeniably heavier. Camilla maintained her position, composed and unyielding. The institution endured, yet something subtle had shifted in the air, a recognition that even within centuries-old walls, tension simmers just beneath polished surfaces. Because if one private meeting could ripple into public reckoning, what other negotiations remain hidden? What other decisions hover just beyond visibility? And who, next time, will choose obedience over hesitation or hesitation over obedience? Because in royal history, it's rarely the grand speeches that change everything, it's the quiet refusals that expose the truth no one was meant to see.